Good evening to those listening in either through this Zoom webinar or live on Facebook. Welcome to this conversation that we have titled Just War and Peacemaking, Christian Responses to the War in Ukraine. This will be a conversation that I will have with Jesse Perillo, Dr. Jesse Perillo, and Dr. Matthew Zommer. Jesse Perillo is a lecturer in Christian ethics at DePaul University and an instructor at Central Michigan University. Dr. Zommer is an associate professor and department head for the Criminal Justice Department at the Citadel. And this conversation this evening will examine Christian approaches to war and post-Christian approaches to international crime, such as crimes against humanity. An intense topic, to say the least, but I believe a necessary one. We will allow time for questions at the end. As you have questions, I invite you to type those questions either by using the Q&A function if you're listening in through the webinar, or in the chat on Facebook. So we will dig in, but before we dig in, I do want to acknowledge the moment that we find ourselves in, the moment that has led to us having this conversation in the first place, and that is obviously the ongoing war that rages in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. As priest of the parish here, we've had a lot of conversation in some of our small groups and some of our Bible studies about what has gone on, and that has given rise to a lot of questions about what is a Christian response to a war and conflict, what are constructive responses to people of goodwill who are wanting to try to build a more peaceful world. And with that wondering, we'll turn to the first question I have, which is going to be for Jesse. Jesse, could you speak a little bit about the baseline Christian responses to war and conflict?
Surely. First, let me just say thank you for having me, and also thank you for those who are gathering here at the end of your day. It's a tough conversation, but I'm certainly glad that you've come to join us. In regards to major approaches, there are three major approaches that exist on a continuum. There is the pacifist response, there is the just war response, and then there is the holy war approach or response. And it's often helpful to think about all three, even though most Christian theologians, Christian leaders would not be speaking about holy war in the present, or at least not a majority would be, because it helps put the just war tradition as a moderating element on war, where pacifism is an outright critique, where holy war is divine support for it, just war exists in the middle. And what's important is to consider how these sort of cycle through the tradition, depending on how close the Christian church or the Christian community is tied to the state. Because as you can imagine, the closer the Christian community or a Christian institution is tied to a state, the more it has to deal with war and sort of find some way of either supporting it or moderating that view of war instead of just being an outright critic. If one looks at the early church, there was much more of a pacifist element, and that corresponds with a time when Christians were outcasts, where there was Christian persecution. And so certainly if you think about Christians being the outsider, those being persecuted, the development or the pacifist response seems readily available, much easier to adopt. Once Christians became prominent members of society, once Christianity was tied to an emperor or a king, then the pacifist approach becomes much more problematic. You see a shift in Christian ethics and also Christian theology that sort of allows for war, that allows for it to exist in this middle ground. And we see, certainly as we move forward into medieval times, an outright justification for war. When a church might be advocating for a specific religious leader, there becomes, when the church advocates for a certain political leader, there becomes more of a justification for a holy war, a divine war. And we see ourselves now in the present where, whether people appreciate it or not, there is a greater separation between church and state. There is more of a distinction, or even the process of secularization, where Christianity is a voice in the room, but not the voice in the room. And we see, because of that, more of a pacifist approach or a just peacemaking approach developing because of that change in relation to the state.
So when you talk about just peacemaking, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Just peacemaking is the language that many are using in the present as a response to the idea of just war. I don't want to go too much into just war, as I assume that Dr. Zommer will address many elements of it. But there has been a history of Christian thinkers, Christian activists, thinking that the minute somebody adopts the just war approach, that one gives over too much already. One gives over to the logic of war too easily. And one looks at just the moment of conflict instead of what led to it, or what practices could have tempered it before it ever even had time to develop. And so just peacemaking suggests that we not think just about the war in the moment, but what could be done ahead of time. I think in the US context, the distinction we often think about is the difference between the Department of Defense and the State Department. Do they serve different roles, and thinking about thinking about what can be done to avoid war, temper it before it ever starts.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do want to bring you into this conversation, Matthew, from your vantage point. Where do you see points of intersection with what has been said, and where in your work are there points of divergence?
Well, I think that if you look at how just war developed with St. Augustine, and then later, years later, St. Thomas Aquinas developed a more thorough just war theory, in which there's a certain criteria. There's jus ad bellum, the justification to go to war, and then there's the treatment in war, and that's the jus in bello. And that's really the Christian era of just war theory. The post-Christian era dates to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which was the final treaty to end most of the European religious wars and the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire. At that point, you see the influence of international law, in particular a just jurist, a Dutch jurist and humanist by the name of Hugo de Groot, who basically argued, get the religion out of just war and let's focus on interactions between sovereign states. And let's have bilateral and then later multilateral treaties. And so I think there's a fine line here where you have the Christian era of just war, and then you have what many people would argue the more sterile international law perspective. And it's never been truly abandoned. If you look at almost every conflict that I've studied in the 20th and 21st century, there is a religious component to it. Even right now, if you look at what's happening in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church, 70% of Russians identify themselves as Orthodox. The patriarch is a close friend of Putin, had ties with the KGB, and 2 years ago was blessing armaments with holy water. And so I do think that even though we can say, well, at least from my perspective, what I study, what I teach, what I write about is the more international law, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, the genocide. It's difficult to take the religion out in reality. And when I think about the war in Ukraine, when was the last time there was an interstate war of this magnitude between two Christian states?
Mhm.
I honestly can't think of in a while.
Yeah, and states that have such ties to one another. I mean, this is in many ways a rivalry within the same ethnic family, which unfortunately, I think there's other examples of that. Sometimes those are the most brutal conflicts that we see in the world. I'm thinking certainly of Israel, Palestine as well. But I will say that I think in the when you look at 20th century conflicts, we certainly can look at the example of World War II and what happened there. And I think with the looking back, that is a war that I think many people understood to be justifiable, because of the historical circumstances that were going on. And I think since World War II, there have been a number of conflicts that one could point to that have seemed much more ethically questionable, murky, where the rationale was not as clear for people. But here we have this large, powerful Russian army invading a much smaller neighbor. And folks that I have talked to at St. Stephen's and many of our small groups have said that there's a feeling here that of clarity, and I wonder sort of hearing that, and maybe I would start with you, Jesse, as an ethics professor. In today's world, what might be the makings of a sort of a just war? I mean, how would you respond to that?
Well, as an ethicist, I'll take your question and I'll answer what I want. No, I will answer that. I'd like to go back to your point about World War II because I think it's rather instructive. While I think many of us look at that war and find there's no reason to even suggest maybe even a pacifist response. Indeed, many people suggest a pacifist response wasn't going to stop it, wasn't going to address what's going on. There were famous pacifists who were very vocal regarding World War II. Most notably, Dorothy Day adopted a pacifist response as one of the leaders of the Catholic Worker. And the Catholic Worker movement and certainly the Catholic Worker paper was affected by that. They saw many people, cancel their subscriptions, not be as active anymore. Notably, though, she adopted what we'd call a principled pacifist position, where she was not critiquing those who responded, who went to war, who went to be of service from the U.S. context, but she admitted and she wanted to have many in the worker serve as a counterexample, just as a claim to say that we as individuals could not adopt a violent attitude without condemning anybody else, and whether there was still need for some symbol or some remnant of people who were not going to condone war, just as a way to keep a broader vision of what could be possible or what could happen. So I mentioned that even in that war, there were people who took what's called that principled pacifist approach, saying, I can't, but I won't condemn others. As for the present, I don't know of many who would critique or find an unjust war that was defensive on one's own territory. There is very little ground for that. And, particularly the idea that one is in a defensive posture often frees one from critique, across Christian denominations. Famously, Martin Luther had this idea that maybe you can't defend violence against yourself, that there might be a Christian justification to not respond with violence if it was your life. But for him and for much of the tradition after him, there's an understanding that you have an obligation to the neighbor, and that you can't choose pacifism for your neighbor, because in many ways, pacifism is a more rigorous calling. It's harder to adopt, and it can't be the standard for all, or not so easily the standard for all. And that maybe one has to almost give up one's purity in a pure pacifist approach in order to attend to the needs of others. And so there is that idea to work with, and which I would find hard pressed not to apply to the present.
And I wonder, Matthew, given sort of international crime, international law, I mean, in today's world, is there a textbook definition of what constitutes a just war?
Well, I mean, if you look at like the just war as it was created and interpreted by Christianity, there are certain concepts, but they're very vague concepts like proportionality. The force used must be proportional. There must be distinction between civilians and combatants. There's another term, military necessity. Is the target a military necessity? Will it shorten the war by targeting it? And so there are these concepts that theorists, lawyers, philosophers argue about. But my issue is that from an operational perspective, how do you apply this to combat? And that perhaps is because I'm at a military college and many of my students commission. And so when I teach this material, I say, oh, this is, proportionality. Immediately they're like, well, what are the rules of engagement issued by the Judge Advocate General, the military lawyers? And so I guess there's this fine line between the philosophical and then the actual practical. Now, what I analyze specifically is international crime. And there's only 4 international crimes. And that's the crime of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And right now, Putin's hitting at least, definitely 3 of them. And if you look at the mass graves that have been found in the last 3 days, you're seeing the front page of, the New York Post the other day with the big G word, genocide. And genocide is a very specific legal concept. And it's very difficult to prove because you have to prove intent. And so that's where my perspective with this is coming from, is the prosecution.
If I can I add something to that? Particularly in addition to some of the terms, some of the categories in the just war tradition, like proportionality, like distinction between combatants that were named. Something that I think is important to add is whether the Christian perspective or whether people in general outside of any tradition see just war as making a war good or more tolerable. And there's been a fair amount of debate on this, at least within Christian circles, particularly in basically the response to trying to address potential terrorism, that, would some preemptive wars actually be good, or are they just a recognition of some sort of fallenness? And there's perhaps a little bit of creep to the idea with some within the Christian tradition that just war is like a justified war, meaning it's good, versus the idea that it's moderating the worst of us. And this is a classic, Christian idea of, what the state does. Does the state bring out the best in us, or does it prevent the worst in us? And so that big idea, which is connected to things much outside of war, is tied to this area as well. And I think that's one of these questions that we're having, not just about this war, but about the US in general. And a lot of states are having this question of, is the state supposed to perfect us, or just keep us from killing each other, or keep the worst of us down? And just something to add to that.
From a Christian perspective, Jesse, is there such a thing as a preemptive just war? I mean, you talked about how you would be hard pressed to make a critique of a defensive war on your own territory, like what's happening in Ukraine. But
I would say there's no uniform response. So there are certainly those who make it, but I don't think that there is uniform consensus on this. And so certainly people have made that argument, particularly in the last 15, 20 years, but particularly as tied to what was called like the Bush Doctrine, but has one side won over that? Not that I believe so. Yeah,
it becomes a more debatable topic.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, the next question I have is really gets at where you were going, Jesse, when you were talking about the example of World War II, when you were talking about the example of a group of people who were holding out that pacifist ideal, even as soldiers were doing battle with one another. I mean, I do wonder, and it'd be interesting to hear both of you comment on this. Sort of, what is the role of the church today? What are constructive ways that religious entities can work for good, can work for peace, can be active agents in a time of war and conflict to help resolve those conflicts? You want to go first, Jesse?
Okay. Well, to help that transition, I think whenever somebody is reflecting on pacifism, either as the path to take or as a critique to keep in one's heart, even if it's not how one physically acts, there's this turn to the Sermon of the Mount. For anybody who makes a pacifist argument, reflects on it, challenges it, they usually give some interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, or 5:21-7, and how one struggles with that. Famously, it's the lines that go, "You have heard this, but I say this," and there are, I think, 14 different categories that are addressed there. And I think what one has to deal with, whether it's thinking about what I've mentioned before about the role of the state or the role of the church, is whether there's an ideal that is being proposed or an actual practical path of action. When one thinks about what the church is supposed to be, one thinks about the Christian message, particularly in the Sermon of the Mount, do we believe it's an ideal that can be reached, or is it an ideal which we have to recognize is not in our power? I think starting to grapple with that is one of the key things. The second thing I would add to that is actually an element that comes back when you say, what is uniquely Christian about dealing with some of these questions. I think, earlier Matt mentioned that like a lot of the Christian perspective has been taken out of Just War, not fully, but to some extent. And I'd say what I think part of the Christian reflection is right now, and maybe should have always been, is do we see not just a crisis of bodies or a crisis of territory, but do we see a great loss of spirit, hope, religious belief? And is that something that we have to bring back into the conversation about war? Famously, in his book, The Truths of God, Rowan Williams mentioned that, war is not just a conflict of the body, but it's a test of the soul. And, is the Christian church, our communities of faith, addressing that the soul is something that could be lost in conflict? And I think bringing what might be uniquely a Christian concern back into the conversation might be important. I'll give one personal example right now, and it's almost a bit of a confession, but I live in a neighborhood that is predominantly Ukrainian. And there have been protests. Famously, just a week and a half ago, 2 former presidents laid sunflowers at the church nearby. And I can't help but cheer on the resistance when I see a victory, or at least a forestalling of the takeover of city. I can't help but celebrate. And I think what has to be brought into mind is what that celebration also entails. That celebration for one side also meant a loss of often young people on the other side. And, is there a Christian response of thinking there is an unjust aggressor, but there's that loss on that side as well? And I don't think that idea comes often through non-religious perspectives, that there's a lament in some way for the aggressor. Probably not equally. I'd be hard pressed to say that one should have the same type of empathy or outreach. But do we see a loss on both sides and mourn it and not celebrate one side? I think that's something that Christian communities, or maybe all religious communities, are uniquely capable of adding at this moment.
Yeah,
I could say more, but I'll stop.
well said. And I preached a sermon not long ago on moral courage and talked about what is happening in Ukraine. And I too have had those feelings when you see news reports of Ukrainian resistance to this Russian aggression, finding myself cheering on that resistance. And yet, of course, there necessarily means that there will be loss of life on the other side as well. And I guess what I just wonder, based on what you've said, is where are the forums for the church or for non-governmental agencies to really make their voice heard today and be counted in that conversation, allow the kind of faith perspective you were talking about to actually impact the decision-making process in some tangible way. Of course, there is always the ability to protest, right? I mean, peaceful protest. There's always the capacity for faithful people to make their voice heard and to be, in the public square, holding, the powers that be accountable. And we see brave Russians doing that at great risk to themselves on the streets of Moscow and other Russian cities. But short of that, particularly in a society like ours, where there is such a division between church and state, I do still wonder what the tangible ways are for faithful people to act constructively in moments like that. But I want to bring Matthew back into the conversation. I mean, from your vantage point, and when you were talking about those cadets, I couldn't help but wonder about the role of military chaplains or religious voices from that side of things. But I wonder how, in your work, you might see the church writ large as being able to be a constructive force for good and for peace in the midst of war and conflict.
Well, I mean, I think it's from different perspectives. Jesse brought up the personal, your own faith, and as I consider myself to be a Christian, I find myself struggling when I'm cheering on seeing Russian tanks being obliterated, aggressors, but at the same time, as soon as I cheer that on, I feel a pang of guilt because next to my bed is Tolstoy's interpretation of the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, which is a radical pacifistic perspective of Christianity. And when I think about the role of church leaders, I don't want to talk about something even at least equally depressing, if not more, is my work in Rwanda and post-atrocity reconciliation. And many people are of the opinion that the Rwandan genocide could have been prevented if the priests had just said no to the radicalization. And I think the role of Christian leaders, and again, I think about that Russian Orthodox, patriarch right now justifying this war. Isn't the role of Christian leaders to stop the radicalization? But just to, not add more and more complexity to it, at the Citadel, I've had personal conversations and conversations with my students that feel the conflict that they're commissioning or they're already in the military. And they struggle with their Christian faith. But isn't that what it means to be a Christian, is to have that internal struggle? I don't have an answer to that, but.
Jesse, I've lost your audio for a second.
Hi there, sorry. The mute button was hanging at my waist. I want to echo what Matt said there, because I think many Christian writers, whether they're ethicists or, mystics who are engaging with the political, will ask one to be attentive and not give the next step. And I think, often in the present, we think about attention as silence. And because, of course, if you're attending something, you're not speaking, or at least not right away. But that shouldn't mean that that initial act of forming attention, of reflecting, of pausing, is not a significant act in itself. I think particularly in the present, when we're so looking forward to an immediate response, an immediate action, to say that we have an opinion on something, that element of pause and the element of doubt that was just mentioned is actually rather significant, and something that isn't echoed enough or isn't paused, somebody doesn't pause with enough, and that is rather significant. I don't know, from my own news consumption, whether that much doubt is readily admitted to, before conflict, leading up to a conflict, or while in the midst of it. So basically, to echo that point, where engaging in doubt, maybe coming to sessions like this, maybe continuing them afterwards, and admitting that one is struggling with these issues is a significant act, even if it doesn't seem to be world-changing by itself immediately.
Yeah, I mean, and that's right. I mean, and of course, I've heard you guys bring up Matthew, you brought up the, I think the power and the responsibility that is in the hands of all religious leaders that can be used for good or for ill. And, you've certainly brought up the example of the Russian patriarch who is using religious language to support the invasion of a sovereign country. But of course, there is the opportunity for other religious leaders to push back against all that. And I think that I will just say from my own vantage point as a priest and pastor, that responsibility is a weighty one, and one that I know that all clergy across denominations wrestle with all the time, because depending on the context, there can be discomfort in the pews when the priest brings perceived politics into the pulpit. And yet politics at its most basic level for me is a discourse on how community and nation states organize themselves. To me, not talking about politics from the pulpit means that we as clergy are ceding too much ground, remaining silent too often on things that I believe the church should have a say about. And I am grateful for all sorts of Christian witness for peace and for reconciliation. I mean, in the Anglican world, we just lost Desmond Tutu, who certainly was a great voice, I think, for peace and reconciliation in the world. But we also do have the opportunity, I think, in community, through conversation, like you've all said, through wrestling with these issues, through coming to worship and prayerfully being caught up short a little bit when we think about what is going on in the wider world. I think that is right on. But I think I would also wonder whether in this day and age, standing for truth is not a way that the church can be a force for peace in this world. Because I think about the rise of social media. I think about the ability that people have today that feels unique in human history to filter information that people receive and distort it, and the way those distortions have led to violence and conflict and war in communities, in our own country and in the wider world. I have increasingly begun to wonder if the church doesn't have a call to be a space where truth can be told in love, but told nonetheless, because that distortion just feels very pernicious to me. And I wonder if either of you have a reflection on that.
I guess I have doubts and concerns and questions that follow with that. Not that there is doubt about speaking truth in the moment, but I would say that there's a question of whether the church acts when it is overtly political, or if what it does by itself is a politics in and of itself. Does one have to be trained to think about peace or conflict? Or as one engages with one's community, is one already being formed and changed? Is one already thinking about what separates? While it originally the passage that I'm about to refer to is more about the distinction between wealth and poverty in the church when it celebrates, I think it certainly could be applied to the present moment. There's a moment in 1 Corinthians when Paul chastises the church for celebrating when it has such division amongst its ranks.
Mhm.
And notably, he, mentions that if one sort of consumes or receives the Eucharist when there's such division in the church, one is judging themselves. One is automatically already in the process of judging oneself. And so I think what he was getting at and what might be about that truth is not so much about war in the present, but what led to it. What practices have we engaged in that allow that to readily occur? Does one get political right now? Or is the problem that there isn't an active populace thinking politically the whole time through? Famously, there's an ethicist a Christian ethicist, who argued that Christians should stop voting. And that comes off as rather jarring, but his claim was that he wanted people to stop thinking about their political engagement through voting alone. And particularly in a US context where that meant choosing one side versus another and no middle ground. And so I think some of those questions about what does it mean to be political in the present or leading up to something might be sort of where one has to go, because I don't know what a leader or a member in a congregation does immediately in the present that's going to feel like it has staying power, unless it's a life that has been changed, not just a response in the current moment. And I think one thing that the Christian tradition is starting to deal with, and certainly secular tradition as well, is thinking about just war and thinking about what are the responsibilities after the war is over. Because after this war is over, hopefully it ends soon, will it be ignored? And will the resources, will the rebuilding be, never really addressed? Will the idea that one has a connection or responsibility end there? Because I think as a layperson, people in everyday lives, they might not have much to add in the midst of war, but there might be a lot to add after war about continual support of people there to rebuild, all the devastation that we've seen, and that might be a response as well.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think what I meant on the truth front was a formational observation that you can't move towards reconciliation if you don't have truth telling, which certainly, referencing Desmond Tutu a little while ago, that was so much about what his work in South Africa was about. And thinking about the South Africa example, of course, was an attempt by someone like Tutu and his commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to try to hold the wide gap between perpetrators and victims and figure out a constructive way forward. I wonder if there may be smaller examples of that in communities that churches can be about, that help form people in the way of peacemaking, that in the long run can make a big difference. But certainly no doubt on the other side of conflict, and maybe Matthew, that might be something to bring you in on, there may be wonderful examples of the ways in which people of faith and church communities have been helpful after war and conflict come in and help communities rebuild.
Well, I think, when I was in Rwanda and doing work on post-atrocity reconciliation, you had Hutu and Tutsis that, hated each other, that were responsible for killing the other person's family. And through a sense of, faith and also national pride, reconciliation was possible. Now, what Jesse was getting at with the post-conflict, from my perspective, as somebody who studies international crime, is who, if anyone, is ever going to be prosecuted for the atrocities that have been committed. And how is the historical record, what I consider to be the truth, the historical record, going to be set? And my greatest fear right now is that if history is any example, atrocities lead to reciprocal atrocities. And my personal fear is that with the atrocities that have been discovered in the less than 4 or 5 days at this point, we're going to see something get much, much worse because it's going to be a reciprocal lex talionis. And that will make reconciliation very, very difficult.
Absolutely. Yeah. One, you wonder when this war is over and, you know, God willing, that day will be sooner rather than later. You think about the trauma that is going to be that's going to have to be worked through on the ground in Ukraine. The generational trauma, you know, I think that might get passed on from something as impactful as this, and you wonder how not only the Ukrainian people will be able to pick themselves up and find a way to move on, but how a country like Ukraine will be able to continue in any way, shape, or form to carry forward relations with their neighbor Russia after something like this, and you wonder who the figures might be or who the entities might need to be, you know, along the lines of a Tutu or a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or something that could be formed that could facilitate or enable the kind of dialogue that I think is going to need to happen in order for there to be even some semblance of reconciliation, even on the margins after.
In response to that, I mean, I think maybe one of the issues right now is that there are elements of the past that still haven't been addressed between those entities, you know, most significantly, and excuse my pronunciation, for what is often called the Holodomor, which was from the Ukrainian perspective, the forced starvation of Ukraine, because most of their grain was going to Moscow and to the Russian army decades ago. And, you know, I think we speak about this moment, but it might be that that truth hasn't really fully been spoken yet from decades ago. And so it'll be not just addressing this current moment, but the fact that the memory of a starvation hasn't really been addressed, and quite frankly hasn't been, I think, part of the public conversation in the present, at least in my reading and my observation of how people are speaking about it.
Well, we're getting towards the end of our time, and we do have some questions. And so Andrea McKellar from our parish, who's our expert on all things technology related, is here now, who will be posing those questions that have been coming in.
Great. I'm gonna, have a few people watching on Facebook. And so I'm gonna do theirs first since we haven't seen it. One, Julie had a comment that just, I really appreciate the idea that to be Christian is to wrestle with these challenges. But then our question is from Louise. How do we align the gospel truth with what in the secular world is called human rights education?
I guess I'll take that since it started with the Christian element. I think the question that I would pose back, just as an ability to start a conversation, is what the idea of human rights is grounded on, and whether human rights assumes that we are individuals first, with claims that can be made against one another, and that certain rights can be, certain loss of rights can ever be compensated for, or that there's an ability to restore something after it's been taken away. I often rights assumes a certain antagonism that is just grounded in who we are. And I wonder if, thinking about an idea of justice, think about a sense of communal responsibility or obligations, and not just claims against the other, might be another way of thinking about this.
Adam, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I was wondering, Matthew, did you have anything from your vantage point you could add to that?
Well, when I think about the modern history of human rights, it really is post-Enlightenment secular philosophers, those that created what is considered the first modern human rights document, which is the U.S. Bill of Rights. And most historians do agree that the Bill of Rights is the first modern human rights document, treaty, one could say, or at least an agreement between the government and the people. And it is secular. It is a secular document. So I could see how there could be this conflict between trying to incorporate the Gospels into something as universal as human rights, which is, on its face, blind of all religion, because regardless of your religion, even if you have no religion, you have these rights to life, to pursuit of, we call it happiness, but to be free from torture, to be free from, persecution.
There's an Orthodox thinker right now. He's a philosopher, but often turns to the Greek Orthodox tradition. His name is Christos Yanaris. And one of his responses to human rights discourses is that they're absolutely important. And they need to be upheld. But he says, from a Christian perspective, it's to ignore the greater connection we're called to have, and that is celebrated. And so he thinks, rights in many ways, if it's the best we can get, certainly go for that. But he thinks that the celebration within the Christian church demands so much more of us. And so keep one foot in human rights discourses, but if one is also celebrating with a community within the Christian tradition, that one has to think if there is more left to be done.
Well, and I just think that also goes back to what was said earlier about the struggle, that, what it means to be a Christian is to wrestle and to struggle with these things, to think about so much more than the category of individual rights. And I do see in the chat here that Kemp Lewis wrote that we should also think about the Russian people, even if duped and used by Putin, and thinking about the misinformation. And I would imagine the conscripted Russian soldiers who I think likely went into Ukraine without knowing the facts of what they were going to find there. I think as Christian people, as faithful people, we need to hold all of that in our hearts as we think about these very complex ethical issues.
Yeah, I'd appreciated what I think it was Jesse said about that. When we hear that a city's been taken back, and we want to cheer and remember that there's also people that are being harmed by that. But, we have another question from Roy. Do you think that the fallen nature of humanity, as portrayed in Genesis, Cain and Abel, and by St. Augustine, means we will forever have an excuse to continue violence, whether in an unjust war, rhetoric, the media, or a slap at the Oscars?
Well, coming from a Christian perspective, Jesse, here, so why don't you?
Okay. I would say to Roy, the debate on how deeply sin wounds us, wounds humanity, is a question that the Christian tradition, Christian denominations, Christian theologians, people of goodwill everywhere have been debating. And whether that sin is something that can be minimized, or whether in its full depths it has control. And I mean, to fully answer that would be to try to give a singular answer to, thousands and thousands of years of theologians and people of goodwill debating this. And I think what you have to maybe ask, and what is the conversation for, a community that gathers, whether it's within the church or at a dinner table, or, just outside when it starts to get nice. I'm in Chicago, so it's not nice yet. You know, how much of a change do you think you can affect, and have that conversation with people? Because I think the minute you have that conversation, you think not just about war, but you think about what you hope for your government. You think about what you hope your church is capable of accomplishing, just with conflicts within it itself. And so, again, I'd say, if you think that that sense of fallenness is too severe and it justifies too much, tell your friends, your loved ones, those you engage with, that you think that there's another reading of the scriptures, of the tradition, that is more hopeful, that suggests that more can be done.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, Roy, and that question tying in war and conflict with the slap heard around the world from the Academy Awards, and it's interesting. I heard the columnist Charles Blow talk about that slap from the Oscars, and was reflecting on how that was getting so much play while a war rages in Eastern Europe, and he was saying, in some ways it's a distraction for people, and it's a small thing that people can wrap their arms around, and in some ways it's like a Rorschach test that people can look at it from different perspectives. But I also thinking about that moment, realized Will Smith was pulled over and there were people praying with him afterwards, and but I would hope that our fallen nature doesn't lead us to excuse these behaviors, but as you were saying, Jesse, to try to come to a more hopeful vision of what's possible for the future. But to be sure, there are no shortage of examples of war and conflict. And it must be said that it's interesting that this war in Ukraine is getting so much notice. But of course, there have been many other wars that have been raging in other parts of the world, in non-European parts of the world, that continue to be a scourge for the people in those places. And it can be overwhelming at times. And I guess maybe that might be a closing wondering that I have. Do we have any other questions, or can I ask this wondering? No more questions. Okay. I have, I wonder, Matthew, the work that you do dealing with international crime and counterterrorism and crimes against humanity is such a heavy subject to focus yourself on. And I wonder, in your work, and I would ask the same of you, Jesse, and in the midst of all the war and conflict that we're having to deal with, where you personally find hope for yourself today. I'll start with Matthew.
I find hope in my students, the mature young men and women that I teach. They give me hope. I find hope in my faith. The quote that I should probably have actually tattooed on me at some point is by Theodore Rector: "In a dark time, the eye begins to see." And that is something that I've held very, very close to my heart and spiritually for decades now, since I've been studying basically man's capacity for cruelty towards fellow man, which is in a nutshell what I study. And in a dark time, the eye begins to see is, my mantra in times like these.
There's some Easter truth in that statement. Thank you, Matthew. Jesse.
That was a nice segue, Adam, because part of my hope is not bringing my own hope. And, as Matt said, certainly the hope is in faith, and I often think about the hope in the response, oddly, that we read being given to Job of, he has doubts at the end of the book. Some say it's a trial at the end of the book of Job. And, the response is, look at creation, look at everything that exists. And isn't that a bit of a response? Not maybe the final response, but the building up of a response. And oddly, I find my hope first, often on the worst days, thinking about the environment and its beauty. But then secondly, believing that a hope has been promised and that I alone am not the one bringing it, and maybe waiting in Holy Saturday a little bit and watching and praying and not closing off doubt, not closing off things too easily by myself, but waiting for the promise, within the faith that there is something else.
Well, that is a wonderful segue for those listening in to Holy Week.
That wasn't planned.
So hopefully those listening in, if you are in the Charleston area, might join us as we walk through this sacred time of year and through the liturgies of the week as we move towards Easter, reflect on where we find hope and resurrection, even in the midst of war and conflict and death and some of the worst things that the world can throw at us. I have really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much, Jesse and Matthew, for being a part of it. Thank you, Andrea, for your support. Thank you for those who've listened in. Continue to hold the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia in your prayers as this conflict continues, as well as all victims of war and conflict. Continue to wrestle with these things in your heart, and stay tuned for more opportunities. And certainly, if you are part of St. Stephen's, we will look for other opportunities where we can carry this conversation forward. But hope you all have a good and peaceful night, and you take care. Thanks for listening in. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.